I'm Paul McGuire, and you have been joining me on a ride in space and time and outside of space and time. So let's go back to the beginning. Now, let's call the stories that you and I have heard about the beginning, let's call them templates, okay? And let's say there's two primary templates or two primary sources of programming or coding. One is true, one is false. But what you believe determines everything about your life. So on one hand, what is the primary programming that is disseminated hypnotically through media, education, entertainment, culture, science, and so on and so forth? What is the primary programming message that you receive from infancy, and you receive it constantly? Well, I'll break it down to you. You know what it is. It's called the theory of evolution. It's called a theory, by the way, because it's never been proven. The theory of evolution, in the most simplest terms, means that you are here in this world by a total accident, random chance. The theory of evolution teaches you that you are an accidental creation. You're no different than the animals. And there's no meaning to life. There's no right. There's no wrong. There's no God. You got here by evolutionary accident, random chance, as if you were going into like a Las Vegas casino, and just things randomly happened. So according to the theory of evolution, you originated around 250 million years ago. Maybe you were a rock or a pebble floating around space. You were non-life, but somehow, magically, mysteriously, you evolved from non-life to some molecular biological structure. I don't know, the saliva of a frog on the moon of Venus. I mean, who knows? Does Venus even have a moon? So let's say you evolved to the molecular substance of the saliva of a frog on the planet Venus. And then slowly, as hundreds of millions of years passed, you became this organism and this little animal and then a little froggy and then I don't know, a squirrel and whatever. And then you've seen that chart of the various apes as they become more man-like looking, and then you see these apes and chimpanzee, and then wham, there's Homo sapien, the first man ape, but it's really a man. Now, the theory of evolution teaches us that one species has the power to evolve into a completely different and separate and superior species. So the whole theory of evolution is based on the theory, scientifically, that one species can evolve into a completely different species. The only problem with that theory is that little transition of one species evolving into a completely different species has never, ever happened in hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. And you say, well, Paul, how do you know that it hasn't happened? It hasn't happened because biologists and archaeologists and scientists to date have collected approximately 80 million fossil records. So they have 80 million fossil records, but they don't have one fossil record that shows any proof that at any time one species ever evolved or changed into a separate species. Ever. They have 80 million records, but not one record shows one species evolving into a separate species. Now, let's not confuse macroevolution with microevolution. Microevolution is when you have a particular species, like let's say you have a sore throat, and let's say it's composed, the doctor says it's a strep throat, and let's say that the sore throat that you have is based on a particular species of a bacteriological infection in your throat. Okay, so it's one particular species. So the doctor tries to kill it with different antibiotics, and this species of sore throat becomes resistant to the antibiotics. That's called microevolution. And that happens, and they have millions of examples of that happening. But when that happens, all you have is the same original species of sore throat teaching itself to be resistant to a particular antibiotic. So it's always the same species of sore throat. The sore throat never evolves into a completely different species. It's always the same species. The species can modify itself within the species, but it can't become a totally different species. That's microevolution. On the macroevolution level, the bigger level, you can never have a species of ape ever, whether you have 500 million years or whatever. A species of ape can never evolve into a man. It has never happened, and it never will. And that would include any species. If you have one species of anything, an animal, a fruit, or a vegetable, if it's one separate and unique species, it never, ever evolves into a totally different species. With 80 million fossil records, this is the overwhelming scientific proof that the theory of evolution cannot be true. And therefore, even though there are a growing number of scientists who know the theory of evolution cannot be true, it's still taught as if it's true in the media and the educational system, because they need the people that control the matrix, the controllers, the people that are the puppet masters. They must have billions of people believing in the lie that there is no God, that they're just evolved animals, that their life has no meaning, that they're here by pure random chance, that there is no right or wrong. They must be able to have a reason to hypnotically program people into that false belief system. The hypnotic programming that they use is called evolution. So they must hypnotize the people and ignore the facts, because that's the only way you can get billions of people on planet Earth to believe that their lives have no significance, that your life has no meaning, your life has no significance, your life has no purpose, your life has no destiny. Why? Because you are here, according to the hypnotic programming of evolution, you're here totally by random chance and accident. You were not created by a God for any particular reason. There is no right, there is no wrong. The fittest survive. All you are is an animal. Now, I just want you to separate for a moment what you think you've been taught as science and biology, just for a moment. Separate that with your understanding of hypnosis and programming. And notice that if you want to enslave the masses, the most efficient way of enslaving the masses is not with armies, it's by enslaving the human mind. So when you teach and indoctrinate and use propaganda and lies, and you hypnotize billions of school children around the world to believe that their lives have absolutely no meaning, no purpose, no reason for living. There's no right, there's no wrong, you have no destiny, all you are is an animal. What you've done in a very clever and sophisticated manner is you have hypnotically programmed those children to be slaves. And they'll never fight. They'll go along with it because they've been programmed in their minds. Now, why will they go along with it? They'll go along with it because they truly believe, even though there's no proof or scientific reality to what they believe, they truly believe that their life has no purpose, no meaning, no destiny. All they are is an accidentally evolved animal that came here by random chance after a couple of 100 million years. Okay? So, because of that, they stop thinking about the possibility that maybe there is a reason or a purpose for their life. Because of the hypnotic programming, they stop thinking about the possibility that maybe they have an awesome and fantastic destiny. Because of the hypnotic programming, they go into the mindset of a slave. Because of the hypnotic programming, they develop the slave mentality. The slave mentality is you keep your head down, you lay low, you never question, you just obey orders, and you follow the person in front of you. You don't deviate from the norm. You don't deviate from the norm because the controllers, the puppet masters, are very sophisticated. And one of the extraordinary instruments they use in mind control is they get, and I really want you to appreciate this, they get the slaves to police each other. They get the slaves to make sure that all the other slaves are thinking and acting like slaves. They get the slaves to spy on one another, so the controllers don't have to do the work. So as long as you act and behave and speak within the controller's definition of what normal is, and normal is to be a happy slave, everything goes fine. But if you start to ask questions, if you start to think outside of the programming of being a slave, if you start to take the red pill in the Matrix movie and really understand that your world, your slave world, is a matrix reality that is an artificial reality. When I'm telling you, you're living in an artificial reality, which is a matrix prison program reality. That's your reality. You think that you're free, but you're not free. You think that you're aware, but you're not aware. The proof of that is you can't even answer the three most childlike questions that any free person would be able to answer. You can't answer the question, why am I alive? What is my purpose in life? And what am I doing here on planet Earth? Those are normal questions. And you should be able to answer that. But after all your years in the school system, all your exposure to films, television, and music, all your exposure to culture, you have no clue whatsoever about why you're alive, what your purpose is on planet Earth, and what you're doing here. You have no idea. And they have programmed that into you. Do you know why? Because they know that if you ask those questions, that the entire virtual reality matrix system begins to slowly disintegrate before your eyes. It's like pulling on a thread in a sweater, and if you pull the thread, the entire sweater will unravel. If you start to ask those three questions, it will lead to other questions and other questions and other questions. And what will happen when you start to ask questions in your mind, what happens is the coding that is programmed into you that causes you to believe in this artificial prison reality, the coding structure starts to break down. And all of a sudden, as you're looking at your physical reality exposes itself as an illusion to you. You recognize that your physical reality is not as real and solid as you thought it was, because it's decomposing before your eyes. That's why you looked over, and in the left-hand area of your view, the brick walls of the solitary confinement prison, in the virtual prison that you're in, the bricks in the wall disappeared, and you saw this gaping hole where you will able to perceive a higher real reality that wasn't artificial. And you saw, for 60 seconds, you saw yourself and your real identity in that real world, which was far more beautiful, far more organic, far more colorful, far more rich. It was a free world. For 60 seconds, you were able to look out of the matrix prison reality into a free world. And you developed an incredible hunger for it. You see, the people that have programmed you don't want you to have that hunger, because then you'll stop serving them and their interests as a slave. And so, how do you solve the problem? You solve the problem by gaining a thing that they've told you does not exist. Now think about it. The way they keep you a slave is they program your mind to believe that certain things that are very important to you, they program your mind to believe that certain things don't exist. They have programmed you to believe that truth does not exist. They've programmed you to believe that you're just an animal and your life has no meaning. They've programmed you to believe that your life is meaningless. But the truth will tell you that your life has a destiny and a purpose. The truth is that there is the truth, and the falsehood is there's the counterfeit truth, the illusion, the matrix. But they've programmed you into mocking and laughing at the idea that there is such a thing called truth. And so you will never hear in the classrooms of America or in the totalitarian nations across the world, you will never hear the word truth spoken of in the big sense of the word without cynicism, mocking, and laughter, because they want to use the psychological weapon of peer pressure and the psychological weapon of your own insecurity to brainwash you into believing that there's no such thing as truth. And when you believe there's no such thing as truth, then you will never discover your true identity. You will never discover that you're living in a matrix prison world and that there's a true world outside of that. And you will never discover the biggest truth of all, which is that there is a God. And this God is truth. And that this God has made a way for you to leave the land of being a prisoner and a slave and enter that perfect, beautiful world. But they have taught you since you were a little child. They've said it over and over again in many different ways. They've told you only ignorant people believe in God. Evolution proves that there's no God. Man invented God. Man invented God? No. God doesn't need man to invent him. God exists whether or not man chooses to believe him. But you see, you're being brainwashed. You're being hypnotically programmed because over and over again, you see an ever-ending parade of movie stars and celebrities and news anchors and experts and scientists coming before you on television and other sources of media telling you over and over again that there is no God. It's up to us to save ourselves. There's no God. It's up to us to save ourselves. And then they create counterfeit gods. Why? Because they've already created a counterfeit reality for you to live in. That counterfeit reality is the virtual reality, artificial reality prison matrix that you live in. Real reality is composed of truth and the fact that there's a God. And not only that, your life is not an accident. You're not an evolved animal. You have a purpose and a plan. Why? Because according to the truth, you were created in the image of God and in the likeness of God. You're not an animal. You were created in the image of God. And that is so powerful, and that is so revolutionary, and that is so awesome that they will desperately do anything they can to blind you from seeing that. Now, here's one of the most powerful truths of all. This God knew you before you were born. We're talking about the hospital and being born. This God who exists knew you before you were born. God knew you outside of this present matrix prison reality that we live in. God knew you before the world was created. God knew you before the foundation of the world. God knew you before you were conceived by your father and mother, before the sperm met the egg and you were conceived. God knew you. So God knew you before the dimension of space and time were birthed. God knew you outside of the dimension of space and time. What does this mean? It means that obviously, since God knew you before space and time began, and that you were made in God's own image, that God has a special plan, purpose, and destiny for your life that he wants to release. Now, the controllers, the puppet masters, don't want you to know that. So they will bombard you 24/7. Anything that they can do to occupy your mind. Social media, meaningless interactions in social media, trivia, episodic TV, movies, film, television. Just keep like a hamster in a cage, keep your mind just filled with emptiness and empty thoughts, or appeal to your senses with endless advertisements about food or messages about sex and promises of sexual satisfaction and fantasy vacations and fantasy this and fantasy that, to keep your mind just spinning and spinning and spinning. Because people whose minds are spinning, when your mind spins long enough, you enter a hypnotic state and you forget who you are. Now, if you've never heard me before, my name's Paul McGuire, and I'm here to help you leave the spinning in the hypnotic state. I'm here to help you find not an illusion. That was a wall in your virtual reality matrix prison that disintegrated, and you saw a glimpse of your real identity and the real world. Now, I deal with all this in my new book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. And why I call it the greatest battle is because right now, even as we speak, in the dimension of time and space, we are experiencing, as the human race, the greatest increase, the greatest intensity of an all-out war that exists inside your mind, an all-out war that's going on now that exists inside your mind, a raging battle that is occurring inside the hearts and minds of every man and woman alive, as they're being bombarded with an endless hypnotic thought stream. And yet, there's the Creator who stands outside of time and space and wants to rescue them from this supermax matrix virtual world prison. But in order to do that, you have to understand truth. You have to at least have the bullet points of truth. And in the book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, I talk about how in our time period, this warfare in the mind, and it's a multidimensional warfare, is accelerating at the fastest rate the human race has ever experienced. If you order it now, you can get it at a discount at paulmcguire.us, and you'll get your copy rushed to you before it's available to the general public, as well as an autographed copy. Also at paulmcguire.us, we have all kinds of free videos, the daily Paul McGuire Report radio program, and tons of free information that will help open you up and give you truth so that you can escape this matrix-like reality that you've been in. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. I'm Paul McGuire. We haven't finished yet with the ride. You're listening to Paul McGuire again, and I'm Paul McGuire. Now, let's take us down the trail, the path further on the ride. And let's talk about things that you've been taught that were true, but the reality is that they're possibly illusions okay? So let's talk about one very powerful illusion that many, many people believe. First of all, as we said, everybody is born. And most of you were born either through a C-section or you came out of your mother's womb. That's the vast majority of you. But there's another part of life in this temporary virtual world prison, which biblically is defined as a fallen world, because it's not built as the Creator originally intended life to be for all of mankind. You know, people who are working for the controller and the puppet masters, they program people to have these very negative perceptions about who the Creator, who God is. Extremely negative. And they're not true. The most important thing that we can know is that God is love. So everything He does comes from a place of love. Now, that doesn't mean it's His will that everything that is evil happens. God doesn't rejoice when tragedy happens. God is love. So you may ask, honestly, and you deserve an answer, how could a loving God allow these bad things to happen? Well, it's not what He wants to happen. But the difference between the Creator God, or the infinite personal living God of the universe, and all the man-made systems, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's totalitarian governments, man-made governments, man-made control systems, man-made structures of rulerships, kings and kingdoms, emperors and empires. The difference between these things is that in everything that man builds and creates, man always, except with very few exceptions, everything man creates as a control structure always takes away your freedom of choice. And remember that. Every structure, with very few exceptions, that mankind creates always takes away your freedom of choice and your freedom. Always. The only exceptions to that are almost non-existent. People get angry when you talk about America, but they're angry because they've been programmed to be angry. America has the most unique Constitution, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence of any nation in human history and on planet Earth. That's not propaganda. That's not Americanism. That's not whatever you want to call it. It is simply the truth. And if you take the time to study, which I have, the competing laws of the land developed, for example, by the United Nations and their United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, or the European Union Declaration of Human Rights, or the constitutions or Bill of Rights of other governments, including totalitarian communist governments, etc. All of them, without exception, despite all the talk and boasting of all the freedoms you have, especially by the UN and the EU, when it comes right down to it, you don't have those freedoms. You're told that you do, you're promised that you do, but if you read the documents, like I have, they go down a list of your freedoms, and then halfway down the list, because they're counting on the fact that people aren't going to read the list. Halfway down the list of freedoms that they say they gave you, then they say something like, if you disagree with the UN document or the EU document, and you question it, or you talk about it negatively, or you write something about it negatively, or you think there's a better way, I'm paraphrasing, but this is what they're saying, then we have the right to fine you retroactively throw you in prison, and take away all your property and possessions. If you actually choose to exercise your freedom of speech or freedom of press, which they promise you in the beginning that you have, later down on the list, if you actually use it, there are severe penalties. That's called a lie. That's called you're being conned, hypnotized. Okay, because you don't have to take my word for it. All you have to do is read the documents for yourself, and you will see that they contradict each other. That's not freedom. That's a con job. That's promising freedom and actually delivering slavery. That's what it is. Now, America is far from perfect. We know that. America has committed some egregious sins. America is not a perfect nation by any means. Our freedoms are under attack in America. Why? Because the same controllers who control most of planet Earth and the puppet masters who control most of planet Earth are very busy at work buying off our politicians and our government from both political parties, from both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, from both conservatives and liberals. The controllers, the puppet masters, are buying them, and they're doing the will of the 1%, the super rich, the globalist elite. They're not doing, most of them are not doing the will of the American people if you check the track record. So our founding fathers created a totally unique set of documents for one reason and one reason only. And this is an historical fact, if you bother to read it. And I explain it in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind. Our founding fathers were heavily influenced by the biblical thinking of the Pilgrims and Puritans, who were not only incredible theological students of the Bible, they were philosophers and they were scientists and they were brilliant men and women. So our founding fathers created our founding documents based on the philosophy which was based on a biblical worldview. In Europe, or today the UN and other nations, they based their founding documents on a man-made view or a humanistic view. And as we've seen, whenever you have a man-made control system, you end up sooner or later with a man-made slavery system. There's no exception to that law. That law exists in history. There's no deviation from it. All you have to do is study history. And I'll repeat it. Anytime you have a humanistic or man-made control system, without exception, it will devolve into a slave-master relationship where the government that's designed to serve you will enslave you. There is no exception or deviation to that rule in human history. It happened in ancient Babylon at the Tower of Babel. I wrote about this in our best-selling book, The Babylon Code, with Troy Anderson. I wrote about it in my brand new book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. That is a law. Now, the difference with the American Revolution was that our Declaration of Independence and our Bill of Rights have very unique words. They say that the Creator, capital C, now remember, they're brainwashing children, they're brainwashing people like you and me, and the masses every day to not believe in God, to program people into thinking God is like a Santa Claus or an Easter bunny. They're brainwashing us continually. Why? Because when you don't believe in God, it's easier to make you a slave. Our founding fathers were brilliant men. They were geniuses. They believed in God. And so they deliberately used this language in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. It says, and the Creator, capital C, meaning God, has given us certain inalienable rights. such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, what did they mean by that? The controllers don't want you to know what they mean by that. What they meant by that is that it is a fact that God, the Creator, not some man-made organization, but God, the Creator, gave you certain inalienable rights. What does the fancy word inalienable mean? It means that since these rights were given to you directly by God, no man-made human government has the right to take from you the rights that only God can give you. But you see, pretend you're looking at a blackboard in a school and that's all written in white chalk, or a white board with, blue, like a blue marker or a red marker and a black marker. And let's say that was all written out. Then the teacher would come and quickly erase it because they don't want it to stick in your mind. They don't want you to know that the Creator has given you certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because if you knew that, you would also know that our founding fathers believed that only God can give those powerful rights to men and women, and no man-made government or institution has the right to take away from the people, that's you and me, rights that only God can give them. That's powerful stuff. You see, if people know that, you can't program them to be slaves. In order to hypnotically program people to be slaves, you have to deprogram them from any belief in God, and you have to deprogram them and hypnotize them to not understand the power and the difference in the American Constitution, government, and Bill of Rights versus all the other man-made governments, laws, and institutions that exist around the world. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a totally revolutionary, totally unique, totally different plan for people that will release their destiny. And notice that you will not read anything remotely like that in any government document about any other government in the history of the world, whether it's Europe or communist China or communist Russia or kingdoms in the past or empires in the past. You will never see anything remotely like the liberating and freeing message that we have in our founding documents. It's the American system. This is not rah-rah America. This is the fact that our belief system as a nation was founded on freedom, and freedom comes from love. See, God is love. Forget about your religious, church, funky interpretations of God. Forget about all that stuff. God is love. So, because God's love, God makes statements like, you're given life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That comes from love. Man's institutions, man's governments, man's dictatorships, man's control system is always based on power, control, and making you a slave. Only God, who is love, creates liberating, freeing systems. Now, that doesn't mean for a minute that all the people who called themselves Christians and all the people who did horrible things in the name of religion and God, that doesn't mean that that didn't happen, because it did happen. Some of the most horrible crimes against people and humanity historically have been done in the name of God, Christianity, and religion. That's a fact. So we never deny truth. See, truth will set you free. Truth will bust you out of the matrix. We're never afraid of dealing with truth. So the question is, how does the fact that people who claim to be Christians, claim to be religious, claim to be preaching Christianity or other religions, how is it that they could have enslaved the Africans and packed them on slave ships? How is it they could have slaughtered the Indians? How is it they could have done all these other horrible crimes in the name of the Christian religion? How could that be? And that's a valid question. But the answer to the question is to understand that the violation that occurred, that the violation ultimately of love, that was not done by God. That was done by men and women in the name of God who claim to be Christians, who claim to be followers of Christ. The crime was committed by the individual people or governments who use the name of Christ or religion or Christianity to commit atrocities and abominations on people. You have to separate the two. God is love. God will always act based on love. If people say they're coming in the name of God and they're acting based on hate, they're not coming from God. Well, you could easily say then, well, how could a loving God allow this to happen? That's an important question, but once again, we have to go back to the power of truth and the foundation upon which this reality is based on. And that is this, that God, in the beginning, has given every man and woman alive, up to the present second. God gives all mankind freedom of choice. God is love, but he gives mankind freedom of choice. He gives mankind free will. You see, we have to understand that man and man's institutions and man's control systems and man's government and brainwashing and hypnotic programming are all ways to control and take away man's free will and make man into a robot or a cyborg or an android. Man-made systems of government, man-made systems of artificial reality, man-made systems of matrix prisons, all man-made systems take away man's free will and take away man's free choice and make man a slave without any exceptions. God is completely different. God is all about you have freedom of choice. You have free will. You have to allow yourself to be deprogrammed from the hypnotic trance of thinking that violates God's love. The only way God can be loving is to give you total free will, total freedom of choice, which is what he does. In fact, God has given you to such a radical degree free choice and free will that he will allow you to use your free will and your free choice to rebel against him, to destroy him, to kill him, and to hate him. That's how far God, there is no limit on the free will and the free choice God gives you. God's free choice and free will that he gave men and women is so radical that God allowed men and women to murder his son, Jesus Christ, on a cross and kill him. That's how radical your free choice and free will is. And it has to be that way. And if you say you don't understand, then you need to understand. There's only two options. Either God gives you totally radical free will and free choice, which means you can do anything, including break every law of God, attempt to be God like Lucifer is doing, or revolt against God. That's what free will means and free choice. The other option is God makes you a robot or programs you. Robots have no freedom of choice, no free will. It's one or the other. God made us men and women created in the image of God. In order for us to be fully free as men and women, we must be given by God total free will, total free choice. If God programs us in any way where we have to function like robots or cyborgs or computers, he has destroyed our free will and freedom of choice. If we are people who have no freedom of will and free choice, then we're no longer human. We're some lower species. We're no longer human. Being fully human, as God, the God of love intended, means he has to take the risk of giving you such intensely radical free will and free choice that you will even do evil things up until the point of killing him. And you say, why? Because there's no other way. There's absolutely no other way for it to work. You're either a free human being or you're not. And if you're not a free human being, you're a controlled robot human being. That's what goes along with free will and freedom of choice. So the very thing that every man and woman wants, that you hear people talking about all over the world, is people are crying out for freedom. They want free will and freedom of choice. But all man-made structures, going back to the pyramids and the Tower of Babel, enslave man by stealing his freedom of choice and free will. Freedom is powerful. Jesus Christ said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." It's only freedom that can set you free. The reason America has been the most powerful nation economically, the only nation to produce a massive, prosperous middle class, the only nation to really deliver on its promises of freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and many other freedoms, despite all of the failings and negatives of America, which do exist, the reason America has given more opportunity to more people, and you can't argue against that. We're the only nation where people are attempting to come across our borders constantly. Nobody's trying to sneak across the border into a communist dictatorship. It's because of freedom. Freedom is powerful, and freedom will set you free. What does every man and woman want? What do you want? Deep inside, whether you know it or not, you want to be free of the control system, the matrix, the artificial prison reality that has been constructed for you by controllers and the puppet masters. You want to be free. A puppet is not free. A robot's not free. But every man and every woman deserves the right to be free. And there's only one system on earth that gives that right, and that is a system which is based on God's love, because God's love, by its very nature, must liberate men and women, and it must set them free. In the way God does things, which is always based on love, nobody can be a slave. Nobody is a servant. All men are equal, all women are equal, and all people are free. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us.